You're probably a good builder, heck, maybe even an experienced builder, someone that your friends actively turn to for building tips or help or advice or anything for this game. But you personally feel like you've hit a creative ceiling where your builds feel more like a copy and paste as opposed to something creative formed in your mind and you put it into the game. So how do you fix that? How do you change your builds from looking the same even though they're different structures? Quite literally. Well, there are two tips that I'll be going into depth and explaining about how I personally fix this issue with my builds so that your builds go from looking like this to even this. All right, let's get started. So the first thing that I would do, and the tip that I've shared before, is to use cultures. And when I say use cultures, if you have, and everybody has a culture, but if you have a culture that's personal to you, I would highly recommend using that, because for me personally, if maybe you haven't been able to figure out yet, I am a Nigerian, and I know it may not sound like that, but I am a Nigerian, and I tend to use a lot of the cultures in my own country, infusing them into the builds that I create. And there are a lot of cultures in my country and far more cultures in my continent, Africa. So there's just so many things I can pull from and so many different areas, different aspects that I can add to it. And speaking of adding to it, let's talk about this one specifically. So I needed a barn, and I wanted a barn that would be able to house a lot of animals. Not necessarily inside the barn, but a barn that was there if the animals needed shelter, refuge, that kind of thing. And thinking about the barn, I didn't want to create something atypical. I didn't want anybody to see the barn either if they joined the world through local multiplayer or they saw it in a video and they think, oh yeah, that's a barn. No, I wanted something that actually felt big but still felt creative. So how did I go about doing this? The first thing I thought about was, what does the structure need to do? And usually that's the thought process. When builders are building something, they ask themselves, what does the structure need to do? Sometimes it's the other way around, and to each their own. But usually I ask that question, and when I ask that, I would say, okay, I needed it to house at least 4 different types of animals in the game. And I wanted it to be big, something that is hard to miss, not something tiny tucked away in a corner. I wanted it to be something big. And so I thought that, what could I do with this to make it different? What can I do with this to make this a barn and still feel like I infused my culture into it? So I kept thinking and eventually went along the lines of, I wanted it to be an animal. And then if it was going to be a barn, it needed to be something big. And if it needs to be something big, I need a big animal, some kind of big animal. And the first animal that came to mind was an elephant. Now, when I say elephant, I would completely admit that what was in my head concerning this barn and what you see right now isn't an exact one-to-one of what I thought and what I built. But I did allow it to stay that way. I allowed the build to be as it is. Happy with the fact that I thought about something, I had the vision of what I wanted to do, and I'm satisfied with what I was able to build that was pretty close, maybe not 100% replica, but pretty close to what I had in mind. Because I didn't want to create a giant elephant, a giant looking elephant, and then maybe on the sides you have one animal here, one at the face, and then one at the back. I wanted it to feel like it was welcoming to each and every animal. So I decided to make each part hopefully facing a cardinal direction, to make each part the face of the elephant and its front 2 legs. And that's how it just kept going. And then I kept trying to create this barn that had a face for each animal that it was going to house, or at least the section that it was going to be facing. And I didn't look up a tutorial. I promise there's literally no tutorial on this. Even I don't think I can faithfully rebuild this one-to-one unless I literally rewatch the video that I uploaded to build it. But what I'm trying to say is that dig deep into the culture that you have. Everybody has a culture, whether they know it or not. And if you don't feel like your culture is creative enough for whatever reason that may be, if you have a culture that you really enjoy the aesthetic of. So for example, with something like the Japanese culture, with things like you can add like cherry trees and all of that, you don't necessarily have to stick to yours if you don't want to use yours, but I highly recommend using yours because you probably know it better than everybody else that may not have that as their own culture. Going off from that, the second tip, which I have also shared, is actively using stories, creating lore for your world. Now, I have talked about this a lot and I will still talk about it again because this tip has quite literally changed everything for me. And I spoke about it in the previous video where I said that I will leave a link to the description of the story of the world that I worked in, where the story determined the builds that I made and actively determined where I lived and what I built. This that you're seeing right in front of you is that world, although I'm not doing the story currently. But it's the same world. It's quite literally the same world with the same story. Every single build that you see or even get a glimpse of was quite literally the story determining what I built next. And when I say story, I'll explain it in this way. There are a lot of times that builders build structures for the sake of building the structures themselves. I am also guilty of it because there are a lot of times that I just build it because it's a necessity, not necessarily because it's something creative. But I've learned to start to step away from that and build things that I genuinely find creative, whether it's necessary to build them or not. And usually when it's necessary to build them, the more effort I put into making it creative, because if this is something that I'm going to be using a lot of, I would rather it's something that I'm proud of building as opposed to something I generically built because it fulfills a need and that's it. So with buildings that maybe look the same or they don't feel like anybody lives in it or they feel empty or things like that, more times out of the other times, it's most likely because there is no actual story backing it. And I don't mean you have to invent this entire saga like I did, because I will tell you right now, the story I started with for this world and the story I ended up with is not the entire story that I thought I was going to tell. I did not plan to tell that kind of a story, or even how big the story kept growing and spreading like a tree. That was not the plan. I just started and it just kept going and going. But for your build specifically, maybe your house feels empty because you didn't necessarily think about, okay, who is going to live here? If somebody was going to live here, am I the one living here? Is somebody else living here? Did they plan to stay here for a long period of time? Or was this just something that they built to pass by time while they were here temporarily before they moved on? One of my new subscribers, Godspud, commented on one of the previous videos I made, and they said that what they do for adding personality to their builds is that for like a fishing house, they had a used fishing rod and a book that had actual stories and some fish that was there. So it really doesn't have to be anything elaborate. And things like that, it literally doesn't need to be big. It can be something tiny, something that is not necessarily negligible, but at least it gives your mind something to work off of. So when you're thinking about the building, you're not building it in a generic sense of this is what I believe or what I know houses should look like, or this is what I believe this type of build should look like. You start to do it based on what your mind is feeding off of, or what you have set that your mind should feed off of. So those are just the two tips that I've shared, and two things that have really helped me: storytelling and using my culture. And they have almost never, if not never, failed to bring out some kind of new build that even I am shocked I was able to build. Not necessarily because I have the best building skills, I am still learning a lot about building, but they definitely give me the inspiration, the direction, the creativity that I look for, so that my builds don't end up looking like a Ctrl-C, Ctrl-V, and more of I built something different today and it looks amazing and I'm proud of it. So hopefully that helped. Hopefully that was able to inspire you and give you some ideas, maybe where you can start off from if you didn't have any idea. And again, I'll leave a link to the story for this world in the description. But all that being said, take care and I'll see you in the next one.